Well, good morning. How about the readings for this morning? For a novice preacher, these readings present an embarrassment of riches, almost too many possibilities to consider. Micah offers us an ethic to live by, and of course, the Sermon on the Mount is the poetry by which we understand Christian teaching and promise. What to tackle? It was a note from Matt this week that made me take another look at the epistle this morning. So I decided to take the road less traveled. I grew up in a secular house. My dad is Catholic, well, non-practicing Catholic, and my mother was mostly a Christmas and Easter Episcopalian who felt that music, all music, was the true voice of God. But the truth is that I grew up without any religious education. My parents both had their suspicions around the institution of the church, boundaries of creedal belief systems, and they had their reasons. And I grew up with a nagging suspicion that there must be something more to the reason people went to church than I was hearing at home. While music is key, and thank you all musicians, there had to be more to it than I was able to discern. I went to an Episcopal boarding school in the early 80s. In those days, we had mandatory chapel 4 times a week at 8 a.m. Unlike a lot of my pals, I never really balked at the requirement. I liked sitting in the altar stalls with an interfaith morning prayer and a music offering. I liked feeling that feeling of being settled before the day started. And later in college, when I completed my requirements for an English major, I gravitated to courses in the religion department. I studied religions from around the world. I studied the philosophy of religion, American liberalism. I may not have realized it then, but I know as sure as rain now that I was looking for a key that might help unlock my mind and help me understand what faith is about. The epistle this morning reminded me of this search. I rarely preach on the epistles because they can feel a little schoolish. Paul uses that Greco-Roman rhetorical style that can read like a winding path, meditating around until the logic gets to the moment of the cross. And as we hear in today's letter, the foolishness of the cross, and bang, you stop and say, wow, I'm not really getting this leap. I'm not getting this part. It's not logical. This letter is a 2-part response to the issues that the Corinthians were facing in the nascent Jesus community. Some 20 years after Jesus' death, there were new Christian house churches springing up throughout the region, and they were competing with one another. Does that sound familiar? The first part of the book is concerned with the fractured community that Paul is writing to in Corinth. Corinth had, by all accounts, a very diverse population: Syrians, Egyptians, Greeks, and Jews. There were accounts of the very wealthy and very poor, and they were sharply contrasted. But there seemed to be some upward mobility that was possible. In the early Christian communities, some were following Apollo, who was a Greek rhetorician, and some were following Cephas, perhaps a leader in the Jewish conservative movement. Paul uses his talent as a debater to underline the ultimate truth of Christ's teaching. He writes, "Who is the one who is wise? Where is the scribe? Where is the debater?" Paul does not say that it's his church, Paul's, that's the real church, but skillfully argues that we are all one body under Christ and that Christ is the head of the church. Furthermore, Paul widens his net to talk about the standards by which God is operating. Has God not made foolish the wisdom of the world? God chose what is low and despised in the world, things that are not, to reduce to nothing things that are. That is an astonishing statement. Paul is talking about Jesus bringing creation out of things that are not, as the final inclusion of the marginalized and downtrodden. In this 21st century, I would include that to mean the entire natural world we share on this planet, even the planet herself. I think the 21st century church has an obligation to take this promise outside of these walls. We cannot engage in this creation renewal just on Sunday mornings. The beautiful and enduring aspect of the cross is the way that it remains relevant throughout our lives. Powerful symbols can do that. It's enduring. One that has new meanings each time we change ourselves and mature. Richard Rohr writes, and I quote, "Paul sees the Jews trying to create order in the world by obedience to law and tribe. Greeks try to order creation by understanding, logic, and education. He recognizes that the greatest enemy of ordinary daily goodness and joy is not imperfection, but the demand for some perfection or order. The revelation of the cross says that there is a way through all the absurdity and the tragedy, and that way is precisely through accepting and even using absurdity and tragedy as a part of God's unfathomable agenda." Paul is a master of paradox. In our post-enlightened world, it is the paradox of the cross that still confounds us today. It certainly confounds me. I would be lying if I didn't confess to feeling, from time to time, irritated by facile responses of resurrection and promises of new life and rejoinder. I see the most brilliant physicians whose gift it is to cure and to heal become tongue-tied when trying to address matters outside of their control. Like explaining to a patient that there is nothing more that can be done. Paul writes, "God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong." And I've seen patients convinced that their reward for being a good person is that God has favored them with signs portending a miracle, only to be disappointed and confounded by an unexpected new reality. "I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and the discernment of the discerning I will thwart." We cannot know the mind of God according to our system of wisdom, but as Paul writes, we have the mind of Christ. Of course, we see that mind in the simple commandment to love God and to love our neighbor as ourselves. I was 30 years old when I suddenly went into labor with my first set of twins. It was 7 weeks before my due date, and I was very, very sick. The boys were born, and they were whisked off to the NICU while I was taken to the ICU. And it was a bit touch and go for me, and yet in my haze, I had a strong feeling that all would be well. I knew it. And to this day, I cannot explain it. It wasn't a voice. It was a sense of presence that was sweet and holding. And it let me know that it would be okay. And I wish I could say that I had the same feeling on cue whenever I'm unsettled. I don't. But what I began to discover that was faith is something not learned, but something felt. It was in my helplessness and vulnerability that my mind was no longer a barrier to my experience. In her old age, naturalist and poet Mary Oliver wrote, "Therefore, I look upon everything as a brotherhood and a sisterhood, and I look upon time as no more than an idea, and I consider eternity as another possibility." I think this is the measure of true faith, the sense that this life is both precious, a gift, and not the last word. We are held by something much bigger than our own will. May the foolishness of the cross bring you to a place that is expansive, even extravagant, in the hope of what is to come.
Amen.